Fading into the Background. Written and told by Kiefer Adams. It was a cool summer's day on the island of Sodor. Marklin, the international tank engine, was resting in the sheds near the big station. But not for long. "Wake up, old boy," called his driver as he and the fireman arrived for work. "We've got shunting to do today." "I'll do it later," Marklin yawned grumpily. "No, you'll do it now," said his driver. "Why can't Thomas do it?" Marklin insisted. "He's the station pilot, not me." "The Fat Controller is showing Thomas his new branch line today," the fireman reminded. "Oh, well, that's very well then, but—" "Branch line?" Marklin spluttered. "Since when did Thomas get a branch line?" "Don't you remember?" said the driver. "James had a nasty accident yesterday, so the Fat Controller has praised Thomas with the Farquhar branch for rescuing him." "I can't believe it," Marklin wailed. "I wanted a branch line. How come he gets one?" "Stop complaining, Marklin," said his fireman, "and actually get into gear for once." Rather reluctantly, Marklin puffed angrily out of the shed. Ever since Thomas had arrived on the island, Marklin had been jealous of the blue tank engine. Now that he was going to get a branch line, the anger he had for Thomas had just gotten worse. Meanwhile, Thomas arrived at the main station of his branch line. Farquhar looked to be a beautiful place, and Thomas even said so. The Fat Controller jumped down from his cab. "This is Farquhar Station, Thomas," he said. "It is the top station of your branch line." Thomas looked around, taking all the scenery in. "Excuse me, sir," he inquired, "but why hasn't this yard been used in a long time?" "Well," replied the Fat Controller, "many years ago, when my father was controller, there were 3 coffee pot engines that ran the branch lines of the island. They were sort of vertical boilered engines. One of them used to run this line. Another runs the Brendan branch, which I have since given to Edward, and another used to run at Tidmouth. Unfortunately, the coffee pots had to be taken out of service when the railway expanded." "Oh dear," puffed Thomas. "But I hope you get to enjoy the Farquhar branch just as the coffee pot that was on it before did," said the Fat Controller. "But as you know, you can't just shunt trucks up here, Thomas. I'd like you to find some coaches for your railway so you can start work tomorrow." "Yes, sir, of course, sir," said Thomas. The Fat Controller returned to his cab, and Thomas returned to the main line. A little later, Thomas returned to the carriage sheds of the big station. He was determined to find coaches to work on his branch line. He was just wondering what to go for when he heard a pair of voices. "Look at that little engine," one said. "Oh, doesn't he look so lovely?" the second voice inquired. Thomas was surprised. Standing before him were 2 orange branch line coaches. "Oh, hello there," he puffed. "I haven't seen you in here before." "We're due to have overhauls," said the first coach. "But they're taking quite a while," said the second coach. "Well," said Thomas, "when you've had them, would you like to come and work with me on the Farquhar branch?" "Ooh, that would be wonderful," chimed the coaches. "What are your names?" asked Thomas. "We don't have any," said the second coach sadly. "Well," said Thomas, "we're going to change that. What about Annie and Clarabelle?" "Why?" asked the first coach. "Well," said Thomas, "when I first came to Sodor, my driver and fireman married local women, and they were called Annie and Clarabelle." The coaches were flattered. "We'll take them," the second coach said. "Splendid," beamed Thomas. "Then Annie and Clarabelle it is." Even the Fat Controller was pleased at the names and the coaches when Thomas explained. They were refurbished and soon came to work on Thomas's branch line, and as many would know, they've remained there ever since. Many would also know that while Thomas was away on his branch line, Gordon, Henry and James began to protest. They stated that tender engines don't shunt. They were cross at Edward for doing this, and so they decided to go on strike. The Fat Controller saw to it that they'd be shut up in the shed until they behaved. They were still in the shed when the Fat Controller went to a workshop on the other railway to purchase another tank engine. Marklin came up to the shed and chuckled with delight. "This is just brilliant," he said. "You three have really made a screw-up of this, haven't you?" "Go away, Marklin," called James. "We're in no mood for your nonsense." "Quite right," agreed Gordon. "Why don't you just leave us alone and fade into the background like you've begun to?" huffed Henry. Marklin just laughed. "Is that the best you've got?" he smirked. "I've heard better results from trucks." But Gordon, James and Henry were beginning to pretend not to hear him. Marklin just grunted and puffed away. "I'll do the shunting myself then, shall I?" he smirked. But again, the bigger engines refused to rise to him. When Marklin arrived at the big station, he was in for quite a surprise. The Fat Controller had just returned from the workshops, but he hadn't come back alone. Standing in the station was a little green saddle tank engine with 4 wheels. "I'm so glad I've purchased you, Percy," the Fat Controller was saying. "You will do a splendid job in the yard." "Oh, yes, sir, of course, sir," Percy said. "I'll take you over to Edward," the Fat Controller added. "He'll show you what needs to be done." Percy was delighted. The Fat Controller climbed into his cab, and Percy puffed away. Wait a minute," Marklin shouted. I'm over here. Can't you see me?" But Percy had already puffed away and hadn't heard. I thought he wanted me..." "Oh, give it a rest, Marklin," his driver cut in. "We can do some shunting at least. That new engine will need time to learn what needs to be done." "Fat chance that'll do," Marklin hissed. He bustled back to work. But of course, Percy did well as the new station pilot of Knapford. 3 days had passed since Percy had arrived on the island. I'm sorry to say that Marklin's attitude was getting worse and worse. He was no longer the happy-go-lucky tank engine that first arrived on Sodor, long before Gordon, Henry or Edward had received their numbers. He refused to do most of his work, and the other engines had to pick up his slack. Eventually, it was Thomas who finally lost patience. "I don't know what your problem is towards any of us, but you need to drop the attitude and the disrespect," he said firmly one evening. "Oh, why don't you just toddle off back to Brighton?" scowled Marklin. "I was working this line long before you were given the colours you currently wear." "Is that a threat?" Thomas scowled. "No," said Marklin. "It's a statement. I was the top dog around here before you came swanning in thinking you knew best. How did it feel being dragged behind Gordon's coaches? Or how about when you left your train behind? Or when you couldn't stop trucks from pushing you down the hill? And that's enough!" The signalman at the sheds had heard everything. "Marklin, away with you this instant," he ordered. "And Thomas, return to the shed." Thomas and Marklin exchanged dirty looks as they puffed away. "I'll prove it to you, you little blue runt," Marklin hissed. "Come tomorrow. It's my turn to prove a point." "We'll see," muttered Thomas darkly. "We will see." "You're really letting him get to you, aren't you, Thomas?" chuckled Percy the next morning. "Why can't he just do his own work?" Thomas huffed. "We've got too much to do as it is. The Fat Controller's planning to go to some tramway on holiday in a few weeks, and even he has to deal with Marklin more than us." "Oh well," said Percy. "I think Marklin's jealous." "Jealous?" said Thomas. "What's he got to be jealous of?" "Can't you see it?" said Percy. "You've got a branch line, 2 coaches that adore you, and you've had more adventures than he has." "So," said Thomas, "it doesn't give him the reason to talk down to me." "Take my advice," said Percy. "I might not have been here for long, but I know when an engine's due to buckle under pressure. I learnt all about it from the other engines in the workshops I used to be at. It won't take this Marklin long to realise he can no longer try to outcompete us all." With that in mind, Percy puffed away to his trucks. "He's barely been here a month," Thomas muttered to himself, "and he's giving me advice?" Rather stunned, Thomas left with his coaches to head up to the branch line. Winter soon came and went, and during it, Henry had a nasty accident with the fish train, the Flying Kipper. The Fat Controller sent Henry to Crewe to be overhauled. For the first time in a while, Marklin was finally busy. He sorted the trains out, but didn't get any praise. Gordon and James gave him a very hard time, and so did Thomas. Percy and Edward felt sorry for him, but unfortunately they couldn't defend Marklin when Gordon and James wanted to make their voices heard. A few days before Henry was due back, Gordon finally lost patience. "You've shunted my coaches onto the wrong platform," he bellowed to Marklin. "You always depart from platform 3 at this time," Marklin insisted. Gordon waited for the guard to blow his whistle. When he puffed away, he let out a great cloud of steam. "And that is for what you did to me when you first came here," thundered Gordon. "And what a mistake it was, too!" "Grrr!" bellowed Marklin, as Gordon was out of sight. Eventually, with the help of his crew, he managed to calm down. He slunk away, furious at the mistreatment he had been given. A little later, Edward returned from delivering a stopping goods to the end of the line. He found Marklin sitting in a siding. "Goodness me, old chap, are you all right?" he asked. "I can't carry on like this, Edward," Marklin said. "What am I doing wrong?" "Maybe if you weren't so rude to the others," said Edward, "you'd probably have a better chance in working hard." "Maybe," said Marklin rather glumly. "Things would have been a lot better if it was still you, me, Gordon and Henry." "Now come on, Marklin," said Edward, "that's not fair. Thomas, James and Percy have proved their worth on the railway, and despite their, misadventures, I shall say, we're all really useful. I don't think you understand how lucky you are to be on this railway." "Even when I'm fading into the background," said Marklin. Before Edward could reply, Marklin puffed away. Edward sighed, and he went to get a drink at the water tower, pondering over his thoughts. Before long, Henry returned from Crewe. His new shape had done wonders to his performance. He pulled the express so well that sometimes Gordon was jealous. But despite Henry settling back into routine, the problem with Marklin was still about. "I swear, if he complains about one more train or one more engine or even one more duty, I'm going to lose it," said James. "He's beginning to do me flaming head in." "I can't imagine why," said Henry. "Just once, I wish he would buckle down with his work. He's no good to anyone, bickering and moaning all the time." Apparently he's homesick, said James. If he felt that way, why didn't he just go home when Thomas, Percy and I arrived? As James and Henry continued to bicker, they were blissfully unaware that Marklin was in the yards nearby and had heard everything. James and Henry's conversation felt like the final straw for Marklin. He bustled about the yards, biffing every truck he could find. "What do you think you're doing?" an old truck demanded, as Marklin began to marshal the train. "What does it look like I'm doing? I'm trying to prove a point here." "We're not scheduled for you," said the truck. "Henry is supposed to collect us in a moment. We're part of his stopping service." "Of course you are," said Marklin. Soon, when all the trucks were in place, Marklin buffered up to them quite hard. "Marklin, stop!" said his driver. "This has gone far enough." "Has it?" said Marklin. "I'll show the Fat Controller what I'm capable of. I'm not going to fade into the background anymore." He gave a great cloud of steam and pulled out of the yards. The trucks tried to hold back, but Marklin was determined. "For pity's sake, Marklin," the driver grumbled as he thundered along the line. "Let it go already." "Over my scrap chassis I will," Marklin thundered back. He sped down the line, but the trucks sensed the chance for some fun. Pushing Thomas down a hill was one thing. James's accident in the cow field was another. But the way Marklin had been acting, to the trucks, it was as though he deserved what was coming to him. Without giving him any warning, they surged forwards. "Go on! Faster! Faster!" they shouted. Marklin, though, managed to hold back. "Do that again!" he roared. "I dare you!" And when the trucks did biff Marklin again, he gave such a biff back that the whole train jolted. "Big mistake, boy," scowled the first truck. The whole train surged into Marklin, and unfortunately, this time he couldn't react. The trucks pushed him down a small hill. A sharp bend was at the bottom. "No!" Marklin groaned as his brakes came on with a screech. "Oh yes!" shouted the trucks. They all knew what was coming. Marklin shut his eyes and prepared for the worst. Sure enough, he came off the rails and toppled down a steep embankment. 4 of the trucks toppled after him, and their loads spilt everywhere. A fence was broken, wheel graves were left in the grasslands, and Marklin was hissing steam in all directions. He coughed. Luckily, Marklin's driver and fireman had jumped clear. They went to telephone for help. Edward and Thomas were soon called up the line with the breakdown train. "Oh, great," Marklin hissed. "Just when things couldn't get any Marklin!" bellowed a voice. Marklin's smoke box went dry when the Fat Controller arrived. "What is the meaning of this? You were not supposed to take these trucks out." "I'm sorry, sir," began Marklin, "but your engines, I will not want to hear any excuses," the Fat Controller snapped. "We will get you back on the rails, and when you return to service, you will stay in the yards of the big station until I can trust you to be on the main line again. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," said Marklin bitterly. The Fat Controller turned and walked away. Thomas gave Marklin a sharp look. Just like before, the feeling was mutual. It was a long and miserable week in the shunting yards of the big station for Marklin. At this time, the Fat Controller had gone on his holiday to a tramway on the mainland. Edward was left in charge until he returned. Unfortunately, Marklin was just as bitter as before. Any trace of the tank engine that had arrived all those years ago was now gone. One day, Henry arrived in the yards to find Marklin complaining as always. 6 trains were delayed for me today, he huffed. I had a train of tankers, some box fans, coal trucks, flatbeds. No one is interested, sniffed Henry. Just carry on with your work. You're starting to be a bother for us all. But then again, that's not surprising. Henry snorted away indignantly. Marklin bumped a few trucks and huffed away. That evening, Henry limped into the shed, exhausted. But of course, the Marklin Engine story didn't end there, did it?